Aaron Pincus, the guru, the rabbi, bodhisattva, the dude. How's it going?
Things are good, Chris. Glad to be talking with you.
Thanks for getting up early in the morning to hang out with me, and maybe even missing a faculty meeting or something. Or
Oh, that got rescheduled just as I
uh,
expected it would.
yeah, cool. Okay, so I want to ask you this question. You can time travel. It looks like maybe you're in the kind of place where you actually already are time traveling, based on your background. You can time travel to any dead show in history. Which dead show do you go to and why?
I would say the Return from Hiatus, 1975, August, San Francisco. Busted out all of Blues for Allah, and they had taken about a year and a half off of touring, and people were kind of freaking out and needed to be reassured, and it turned out to be one of the turning points for the music.
And you didn't go to this show. A little
No,
early
I
for
would
you.
only have been 12,
Yeah, a little
unfortunately.
early for you. Okay. How old were you in your first show, or what year was your first show?
1981, June of 81.
Okay.
And that was the Greek Theater in Berkeley.
Nice. That was close by, the San Francisco show.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've told this story many times in different places, but I want to say it here because, and this is all to set up a question that's coming, and it has to do with how we met.
Yeah.
So I was a PhD student doing research, seeing patients, and I couldn't figure out how to connect the two things. A very shortened version of the story. And I needed like a heuristic model, and I was very simple. I just needed a model that said, like, if my patient says this or does this, how am I supposed to respond? And I couldn't figure out a good way to think about that. And like doing factor analyses and whatever, important as it is, didn't tell me that. And then when I would hear people say, well, like, this is why you should do that, or this is what you should do, I couldn't connect it back to like science of like, well, okay, but is that your opinion? Or like, what is the right? And then I read your chapter. Les said I should read about interpersonal stuff in his coy way. I read your chapter and some stuff by Lorna, and I was like, I got to meet this dude. Went to Philadelphia, and then that's where we met and we hung, and we've been hanging out ever since. Okay, this is my question. I've never asked you this before. Can you tell me a little bit about? So this was a chapter, by the way, in this book that also had a chapter by Lorna, and you had a footnote in there that was sort of like it seemed a little bit like you were it felt like maybe you were stepping on toes. You said like, look, there's another chapter in here that's also interpersonal. These are not like competing visions. These are complementary paradigms, and it's the same paradigm. It's just a different way of looking at it. So I'd like to know, and this is the first book where you laid out the assumptions of contemporary integrative interpersonal theory, and I think it's the first time you ever used that phrase in print. Is that? I think that's right.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so take us through like what was the thinking like? Had you been thinking about this for a long time and wanted a place to say it, or was this like you got invited to do a chapter and it kind of led to that, or like how did this come to pass?
Yeah. Well, I think two things were going on at the same time. One, I was, thinking a lot about where we were at in the interpersonal theory and assessment. But I was also doing a lot of psychotherapy training, mostly in the psychodynamic vein, starting with my internship back in, 1991. And I had been doing a lot of object relations-based psychotherapy. I had gone on sabbatical in 2000 to the University of Utah and spent a semester with Lorna, just absorbing everything that she does, which is pretty amazing, frankly, between both her therapy practicum and her rounds at the hospital. And what I kind of gotten to was a point before I started writing that chapter where I felt like the limitation of object relations and contemporary dynamic relational therapy was that there wasn't enough structure to it. There was ideas about an internal world, and you had to figure out, what was going on within the mind of your patient. But there was no organizational structure to how you were supposed to do that. At the same time, I was doing all the interpersonal stuff and, like you mentioned, factor analysis and circumplexes. And what I felt was missing from the interpersonal side was an intrapsychic landscape that I thought was necessary to, understand the person fully. Um, And then I'll bring in one other thread, which was as an undergraduate, I took Alan Elm's psychobiography course. And then as a graduate student, I took Mac Runyon's psychobiography course and really became convinced we have to understand the whole person. So I had this ideas of we have to understand the whole person. I really like including an intrapsychic landscape, but it needs a structure. And I really like the interpersonal approach and model, but it needs to account for intrapsychic processes. And this was all merging at the time that I started writing that chapter.
Mhm.
Plus, probably pretty convinced at that point that the DSM PD categories sucked.
And you frame that as like a new as a kind of a new instantiation of an existing theory with specific assumptions that both distinguished it from things like the DSM, but also from other versions of interpersonal theory. Like, what was your strategy there? How were you thinking about that?
Well, I assumed I had a strategy. Um, I think I was just at that point, I was really just trying to get my points on paper and support it through this idea. A lot of the early part of that chapter is talking about the difference between description and
Yeah,
explanation and
yeah,
theoretical models versus descriptive models. And it was really an effort to integrate that with the idea that that was what we're going to need in the post DSM kind of framework.
right. I mean, it's interesting in part because interpersonal theory is now a whole lot of different things. Just like the word psychodynamic can be, it's like an offshoot of psychodynamic in a way, which itself is many different things. Sometimes I'll read in a chapter like, according to interpersonal theory, X, Y, and Z. I'm like, well, that's according to Aaron's version. There's like, there's a whole tradition that like got off from like the Sullivan line. There's like the circumplex empirical line, and then there's a whole bunch of people doing interpersonal psychology that don't care about circles. And then there's the kind of Sasby Lorna version, and then the people argued about like what's the right way to rotate agents of communion, et cetera. So there's like a lot of different things, but CIIT is currently, I would say, the most popular, at least in the journals that I read. And so, how do you feel about that? Like that it's I mean, you and I share this kind of like multi-paradigmatic, willing to go back and forth between ideas thing. But CIIT has kind of taken on its own life and sometimes is even conflated with interpersonal theory more broadly.
I would say it definitely has been conflated, but it's true. I read more articles in journals that start with, citing CIIT as the basis for whatever the authors are considering, and of course that's very gratifying. I would like it to be broad. That was the point. Was we need to integrate multiple perspectives, and I think the current instantiation really does that quite well. I'm sure there's perspectives that feel left out. But I wanted to respond to your opening story for a minute, if I could,
Oh
because
yeah,
it's
bring
it's
it.
rel it's relevant to your question. I was feeling very very similarly. So I started my graduate work at Berkeley in what was IPAR, Institute for Personality Assessment and Research, and it had a very trait-based tradition. Harrison Goff was there, CPI, various things, and so I got very very deep education at Berkeley on sort of traits from quite an Allportian sense. And I started getting nervous because I felt it was incomplete. It felt like I couldn't put it together with psychotherapy, which was important to me. And so similarly, I went off. I found it was the interpersonal paradigm at the time that really felt the most promising to overcome this anxiety that if I just studied traits for the rest of my career, I probably wouldn't get answers to the questions that I thought were more intriguing.
And of course, I mean, the circular version of that theory sort of started there. So was that just in the air? Like, how did you come across? I mean, eventually you worked with Jerry, but you chose him. Like, you were into this stuff before you went to work with him. Was that introduced to you by somebody, or did you go find it, or was it just around, or?
Well, it certainly was introduced to me. I was very lucky. I mentioned Alan Elms earlier, and I also took, as an undergraduate, Alan's personality theory class. And it was one of these courses, this was life-changing, because he used primary literature. So we read Freud, we read Allport, we read Murray, we read Jung, Erickson, and Sullivan. And so my first introduction to Sullivan was from Alan Elms, and I found it the most companionable with my thinking. When I went to Berkeley, I was able to sort of track it. Well, actually, it was even before then. I was able to track it to Tim Leary, who's I was kind of a fan of for different reasons, and went down to the basement stacks of the UC Davis Library and found a hard copy of Leary 57, which, by the way, was written inside the cover was "Get your own copy, Tim,"
Oh yeah,
uh,
right.
which I still have.
Very
And
nice.
it was the one book I never returned to the library. And whoops, now I'm busted now. But and so between reading that Leary 57 for the first time after starting to absorb Sullivan and then going to Berkeley and having these concerns about, traits only, I just started reading everything I could to catch up, right? So Leary 57, Carson 69, all of the Benjamin 74, and so forth. And I just started doing that as I was starting my master's education in personality, designed a master's thesis, which of course never saw the light of day after it was defended, but was an interpersonal scenario kind of study using the circle. I had actually written to Don Kiesler as a graduate student at Berkeley and asked him about the IMI, the Impact Message Inventory. And he was just coming out at the time with his circular version of that, the circumplex version of that. And he sent me everything. He sent me the manual that was in press. He sent me all kinds of information. And I was like, wow, not only is this answering questions I've been really dying to get at, uh, but the people are very, very nice and collaborative. And that felt like it also had a big impact on me that this major psychotherapy researcher, Don Kiesler, who knows me, doesn't know me at all, lowly graduate student at Berkeley, was so helpful. And so between that and all my reading, I loved Carson's book. Um, I ended up doing a master's that sort of was the prototype for if you're gonna what you're saying about your therapy. If somebody sees this, what do they do? And is there a way to structure and model that using the interpersonal circumplex?
Mhm. And that's what his stuff was about. This thing about like Don Kiesler was talking to me is so funny because this is something that you really learn as you age in this profession of like it's not an imposition when young people are interested in your work. This is like this is really more of an honor than like I don't have time for that. But it's so funny that your story because so the first year of my PhD program in Texas, this like I read your chapter maybe in the spring. I don't know exactly what the timing was, but I remember like I didn't have funding for that summer and I was broke. So I actually got a job waiting tables where I'm from in Michigan. So I left my PhD program for a summer in my little Honda Civic and I brought a guitar and like a bag of clothes and my dog and my wife at the time and her clothes and a big box of papers and a big stack of books, including the ones you mentioned. And by then, a few other things had been published, like Lorna Sasby book and Keesler 96, et cetera. But it was exactly the same thing. And that summer, I just read all the papers. And I literally like printed all of the papers that I could find, keyword search, interpersonal circumplex or whatever. So I had like a box and then a bunch of books. And that's what I did that summer is read all this stuff.
Yeah, yeah. That's where we got, and then I would do this thing which we don't do anymore, which is about every 2 weeks I'd go to the new journals room in the libraries of whatever
Yeah.
university I was at, and there I would thumb through the most recent everythings, JPSPs and various other journals, and just looking for the newest interpersonal stuff.
Right. So every once in a while, like, oh, Gertman has a new paper about interpersonal circles and nomological net. Got to check that out.
Yeah.
So, okay, so you decide to go work with Jerry. What was that like?
Well, do you want to hear a little bit about how I got there, or do you want to just jump to that?
Yeah, we got time, the whole thing.
Yeah. So I had decided at Berkeley that I didn't want to stay in, I wanted to go to a clinical. I wanted to get clinical training. I wanted to do a clinical PhD. I was in the personality psychology program. And the clinic there was not very amenable to having students outside the clinical area get trained. So I realized I had to move. And I applied only to Virginia Commonwealth, where Don Keesler was, and to UBC, where Jerry Wiggins was. And I interviewed at both places. And I remember going out to Richmond, Virginia, and talking with Don and talking with students. And I thought it was a perfectly good meeting. And then I went up and I interviewed with Jerry, and I thought that was a perfectly good meeting. And in the end, uh, Jerry admitted me, and it was only later that I found out they kind of discussed it and made a choice among them who was going to admit me. And at the time, Don felt that I had really good theoretical background, but my quantitative chops maybe were not as advanced as they could be, and they kind of agreed that working with Wiggins might be a better complementary training. As it turned out, it was probably also a better complementary personality match. So I didn't really have a choice. And I remember walking down the street with Oliver John in Berkeley when I was making a final decision, do I stay or do I go? And Oliver was saying to me something like, well, Aaron, psychotherapy is not that romantic. It's not going to be like, it's going to be a lot of people making stupid complaints and some, I can't remember exactly what he
Seems like
said.
something he would say. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, and I said, well, I think I'm going to go anyway. So I went. So what was Jerry like and working with him? Well, it couldn't have been better, frankly, for me. He and I have very complementary personalities. He's very the way he worked, I learned a lot about, I think, two things. One is routine, and the other is relationship. And so what I saw in Jerry was someone who, at least by the time he was working at UBC, he was in his, almost mid 60s, or maybe early 60s. He had a very kind of consistent routine. He came into the department every day around 8 o'clock. He wrote in the mornings till about noon. He always brought his lunch, something I now still do. We have a little room in there that was called the personality reading room, coffee and books and tables, and he would spread out his lunch, Tupperware stuff every day. I'd go in and chat with him. Um, and then in the afternoon, he would teach, and by about 5 o'clock, it was a happy hour. And he did this consistently, regularly, every single day. But the other thing I really learned was how people loved him as a mentor, as a person, as a colleague, as a professional, because of how he treated other people. And he had really fantastic relationships with everybody. I can't really name a person who didn't like him. And I watched him really treat people with respect, really treat people with uh, love, and I decided, that's a good model for how I want to be as a professional.
Mm.
And then the way we worked together, Jerry had a kind of style of making suggestions kind of offhanded, not telling me you need to do this or do this next, but more like, huh, a canonical correlation might be a way of looking at that. And then he'd walk off to his office to keep writing. And then I would realize, oh, I think that's what I'm supposed to do now with that. So I would follow up, and there was never any pressure, never any knocks on the door. Have you done that yet? Just he'd come in and do his things. And when I was ready to show him something, I'd knock on his door. And he was always ready to take a look at what I had. And between that kind of meeting and our regular lunch discussions, we moved a lot of things forward in those 5 years that I was at UBC. And at the same time, I got clinically trained. And it was really more of a holistic, integrative experience than I had at Berkeley.
This is something I learned from Les, actually. This like leave a crumb. Because if you tell somebody what to do and they do it, then they've done what you've told them to. If you just
Hmm.
sort of say, that's a thing somebody could do. I don't know if it's going to work out. And it works, then they get all the credit. And also, it's a test of like, Are you into this or not? And it's okay if you're not into this. If you're not into it, you probably won't pick up on the crumb, and that's fine. You go do something else.
Yeah.
But if you're into it, then yeah, this is, I think, a clever mentoring strategy. So did you pick up this routine too? Did you like decide, okay, I'm also going to come in at 8 and have my lunch in the reading room and
Absolutely not.
yeah, me neither.
I'm like 23. I'm staying up until 1 or 2 in the morning, and I'm usually getting in around 10 or 10:30 in the morning. So that was not my routine. But I saw how a routine, maybe not the same routine, but a routine was useful for both, professional work and possibly even for personal well-being.
Yeah. And I mean, Jerry is, I mean, he's known for the interpersonal stuff, or I don't know if people know him anymore. They should, people might not. But he also wrote like one of the best books about psychometrics ever. He's also like a trade person, and he wrote this Madeline book as kind of really the last big thing that he did in his career, and that was with on purpose because he wanted to make a kind of multi-paradigmatic point. So this is kind of something I've always wondered about him of like, I mean, I get the multi. I'm the same way in a sense. Like I can play in lots of different playgrounds, but I sort of like the circle the best in a way. But like, how do you think he thought about that? Like in terms of devotion, or did he feel like he had a responsibility to promote the virtues of the interpersonal stuff because people weren't necessarily doing it, or was he thinking about how things could be integrated? Or
I would say he had a kind of a two-pronged approach. He certainly could be a champion for the circle and the interpersonal approach. But I think he was also concerned about personality assessment as a whole and how the field is either, siloed or not. And so
Mhm.
his real goal was think broadly, know a lot of stuff, and figure out what fits together. And don't draw boxes around things that don't need to be boxed up.
Yeah. So sort
So
of have the thing that you're really good at, the sort of first lens through which you look, but then be able to look at things through different lenses if you need
yeah,
to.
like when he was writing the agency and communion chapter for the Meal Festschrift, um, I mean, look at the scope of that, right?
It's
From
amazing.
Confucius to French language to the
Yeah.
history of words entering, the lexicon. I mean, he was really thinking about this at multiple levels and very broadly.
I mean, it's a shame that he passed away earlier than he should have, for lots of reasons. But one of them is like the stuff that's happened since he passed away, right around 2000, or I don't remember, I don't know exactly when he passed away, but it was shortly after that, I think. And I never met him. That's one of the reasons for me personally, it was such a shame. But I mean, so much has happened in interpersonal psychology, and really, a lot of the stuff that's happened has started to fulfill the promise of like how the interpersonal paradigm, or what it adds anyway, or how it's different than things like trait. I mean, when he was working, I think the criticism that like, well, E and A isn't that just rotations? Like, why do you take the other three traits out? Like, that's kind of, and it's
Mhm.
people say that, and you sort of like want to pull your hair out, and it's annoying. But at that time, it was kind of a fair criticism because almost all the stuff that was happening was with cross-sectional data and questionnaires and rotating factors, and there's of course complementarity stuff too, to a certain degree. But I mean, since that time, the dynamic stuff that was emphasized and was foreshadowed in Leary and Sullivan, et cetera, has really started to establish empirical roots. I mean, what do you think if he could time travel to now and just look at the state of the interpersonal literature, what do you think what would his take be?
He'd say, I knew it.
He saw it coming.
Yeah, I saw it coming. The thing with the 90s into the early 2000s, right? This is the era I call the five-factor mania.
Yeah.
And, we were, the thing is that Jerry never operated as if the five-factor model and the interpersonal model were competitors in any way. So first of all, he was very good friends with Costa and McCrae and did wonderful things to help me meet them. And he was, soon after the IAS, we ended up saying, oh, look, IAS B5, right? He never wanted to exclude those dimensions, I think it was a little, psychology was maybe perhaps a little overzealous on the five-factor model, but Jerry was very much an FFM guy. He just thought, as he loved to say with a special word, that the two interpersonal dimensions were propedeutic, that those were really kind of like the bases, and you definitely needed to include. He never thought we didn't need to include other dimensions, but he thought they had something special about them. And I think it had to do much more with the system of dynamics and processes and patterning that now has evolved in CIIT. So I think he would
Right.
be very happy with it. But you gotta realize he was never operating as a IPC versus FFM kind of
Sure.
attitude.
Yeah.
And that was never his approach to things.
I don't know anybody who likes interpersonal stuff that has that attitude. I think sometimes there's a projection of that attitude onto people who like the circle, but I don't know anybody who likes the circle that is like, I'm against conscientiousness or something like that. Um, yeah, that's it. Well, I mean, another way in which agency and community are propedeutic arguably is also simply structural. So Digman did that paper with alpha and beta, and the higher order correlations of the big five, to my eyes anyway, look a lot like agency and communion.
Sure, sure,
Um,
totally agree.
were you around when that was, I think, 97? So that would have been, I guess, shortly after you left Berkeley.
Well, that's a funny story because actually, no, I was gone by 97, but in fact, when Jack Digman started doing the higher order factor analysis, he actually started in about 1990
Uh,
and sent his, before any publications on this, he sent his results to Jerry and asked, what do you think of this? And so Jerry, of course, shared them with me. This happened all the time. Somebody would send Jerry something, and Jerry would say, I think you should look at this. I'm going to look at this. Tell me what you think. And so I actually saw that as a graduate student, and we kind of agreed that we thought it said something about agency and communion. And it took Jack a little while to get that published. But I actually saw it in its sort of raw state, not in a manuscript form. And I remember having conversations and playing at the chalkboard with some of Digman's results.
it's funny that, I mean, it's when these things first start taking off, there's all these like weird dogmas, and one of them knows that the five factor trait should be orthogonal. So I can imagine people pushing back against the idea of higher order factors. And there probably is some response set and stuff in there. So maybe, I don't know, it's still maybe not completely agreed upon or whatever. But um, yeah, I feel like I missed something important because this was like the foundation of everything that I came into. But I guess we all have our moment.
Well, you enter when you enter, and then now you're contributing to the foundation. So
Uh,
you may be standing on a shoulder, but you're an original contributor at this point.
I mean, the other cool thing that you said that you also kind of alluded to before when you said that Don Kiesler and Jerry talked about you and you didn't realize it is that I think as you get further into the field, it doesn't take you long to realize this is like the field is really small. Like everybody knows everybody. We all talk to each other. We all have personal relationships. I would say it's friendly with 90% of my colleagues or something like that. And I mean, even when you argue with people and stuff, it's pretty, but like there is a whole kind of like behind the scenes thing. That's one of the reasons I wanted to do this and talk to people is like I have a personal relationship with most of the people that do, or with all the people that do circle stuff really, and more or less. And but also like part of the personal relationship is talking about this nerdy stuff that so few people on the planet care about. And like that's what's fun about it to me. That was fun about like from the very first time we met and hanging out with you and Aiden and all the other people that we hang out with is like with nerding out. To me, that's a lot of what actually happens, but it's not in print. Uh,
Well, this is part of relationship. This is the other part that I said Jerry taught me, right? So he knew he had relationships with all of these people, just all of the people who I would consider at the time, like that I was in graduate school with him from 87 to 92, that were to me the leaders of our small field, not just of interpersonal, but personality and the thing that I really got from that is you get a lot out of having those relationships and doing that nerding out kind of thing. And so he would I would knock on his door and he'd say, "Oh, I just got off the phone with Auke Tellegen," or "I just got off the phone with Paul Costa," or "I just got off the phone with Ted Milan." And and what he did with me is he said, "I want you to meet all these people. I want you to be part of this." And he really wanted me to become part of this, sort of network of scholars. And so he kept pushing me out there to meet these people and do these things. And it would literally like say, "Well, they want me to do this, but I want you, if I want you to do it," right? And off I would go to, Bethesda to meet Paul and Jeff and talk to them about what we're going to work on and things like that. So I think that's been at least, 50% of my scholarly development came from Jerry making sure that I was, in contact with these people, Bob
Yeah.
Hogan and Lorna and everybody else, and Bob Carson, who was a really great friend during the time that he was with us.
Yeah. So you have done all kinds of stuff, but I think the two things that probably you're most known for is the interpersonal stuff and narcissism. Would you have foreshadowed that? Like you're leaving BC, I don't remember what your internship was, but you're getting your first job at you're getting your job at Penn State.
Yeah.
And I tell you, okay,
Well,
I'm talking to you a few years before retirement, and the two things people know Aaron Pincus for are interpersonal psychology and narcissism. Would you say, yeah, that fits? Or was this on purpose, or was this like just happened along the way? Or
well, I think everything is less than on purpose in life.
sure, yeah,
Um, Certainly I came out of, and I did my internship at UBC Hospital, and I stayed an extra year essentially, didn't, and that allowed Jerry and I to continue working together kind of on a daily or almost daily basis. But my internship started this because my internship was really in a psychodynamically oriented psychiatry department, and also a lot of group work, also psychodynamic and process oriented group work. And so um, I think when I left and started at Penn State, I certainly had far more interpersonal chops than I did psychotherapy chops, and really understanding personality from a clinical interactive lens. But I had started that process and I continued it, and I did train with Otto Kernberg and Frank Yeomans and Lorna, and I think what happened was I spent a lot of my first 10 years really working from the interpersonal paradigm, kind of building it up. Sometimes I'd write a review chapter that was sort of just stock what we know at the time, and then I started adding my own things as I became a more confident young scholar. And it was really kind of a parallel process where the psychotherapy with personality disordered patients, which I started really in depth in my internship and never stopped after I got here. I became at Penn State, I became a clinical supervisor, and I do a practicum with personality pathology that I've been doing for 30 years. Um, and so that interaction did two things. One, it really convinced me we need this intrapsychic landscape to be integrated into the interpersonal model. I already talked about that slightly with you. Uh, and it was really later, after, say, the CIIT chapter, that kind of introduced the thinking and the assumptions. So maybe after 2005, that, again, being concerned about the DSM version of personality pathology versus what I was seeing in the consulting room. Um, and it just really struck me. I was seeing a lot of patients that, from a more dynamic, psychodynamic view, you would see as having narcissistic problems. And then you would look at the DSM and you'd be like, well, they would never code out as NPD. And I had this secondary concern, development of a secondary interest, which is we need to really help. If we don't change this, this was in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, 2005-ish. If we don't change how clinical psychology and psychiatry think of narcissism, patients are not going to be helped. And I was really concerned, like, every narcissistic patient I see has some kind of distress. They're
sure.
anxious about things, they're depressed about things.
You mean
And
it's
what I
not high
was seeing,
self-esteem?
huh?
You mean narcissism isn't just high self-esteem?
It's a little more complex than that, I think. And what I was seeing was, people getting trained in ways where if they if a patient said, I feel bad about myself in any way, or I feel anxious about myself in any way, they narcissism was taken off the table. And what that meant was they were going to do some kind of treatment for depression or treatment for anxiety that was going to not help the patient because it didn't really address the underlying causes and mechanisms of their distress. So I kind of think I just decided we need to do something about this. And so, kind of like what you said about CIIT kind of becoming a kind of uh, widely used model, a widely used approach. I think my goal was let's get a broader, more dynamic, not psychodynamic, but intrapsychic view of narcissism that's not all high self-esteem and grandiosity. And now what I see is also very gratifying is most of the time when people are publishing on narcissism, whether it's clinical work or it's research, they distinguish. They say, I'm talking about the grandiose aspects, or I'm talking about the vulnerable aspects. If you go back to prior to about 2009, that was not happening in the
Yeah.
literature, right? People were using trait measures of narcissism that were just like 12 items that said, I'm grandiose in all these ways, and then saying that's narcissism. And so I feel like I've made that contribution that people are at least thinking about it in a different way now. I don't know that we've resolved everything, but I think we have a much better view of the accurate landscape of narcissistic pathology.
I think there's actually been two things that happened kind of in stages. You know this literature better than me, but it seems like the first thing was just adding the content of like the grandiosity is complemented or underlined by the kind of vulnerable piece. But then for a while, the idea was, oh, okay, there's two kinds then. There's like you could be either vulnerable, you could be grandiose, or there's two factors, and like you could be high in one and low in the other, whatever. But kind of the idea was no, they're in a dynamic relationship with one another. Like the reason this person's being an asshole is because their self-esteem was threatened in the first place. So you're kind
Right.
of observe. It's like in soccer when the person gets the yellow card for doing the second thing. It's like, yeah, but the first thing also matters, right? So like I think this is the sort of second thing that people had to pick up on, partly because of like ambulatory designs, which you were sort of on the front lines of also, of like, well, it's not just so much that you can either be vulnerable or narcissist or grandiose, or that like you could be a little bit of one and less of the other. It's more like they go together, and that's the kind of heart of narcissism.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that took longer than
Right.
identifying the components, right? And I completely agree with you. It's not two types and it's not separate. What's happening is, in fact, we now, I mean, if you just look, it's taken the last 3 or 4 years. If you go from like 2022 to now, there's like real good research on dynamic shifting of states. So we've kind of gone from identifying the content to understanding some of the temporal
Mhm.
characteristics of narcissistic states. And when you do that, you see that people aren't one or the other, people are both. And some of the work even suggests, you can be both at the same time, or one can serve as a sort of a way of not feeling or not experiencing the other. So we have a whole new world out there of sort of a temporal dynamic taxonomy of narcissism. We're just starting to get our research chops on because the uh, technology and the analytics have advanced to let us do that.
You said, you know, nothing is totally on purpose. I agree that's probably poorly worded, but I do think people can be more programmatic or less programmatic. Like when you compare my wife Vipka and I, Vipka started off with like, well, people thought traits were stable for a long time. And then Brent Roberts is like, maybe they're not so stable, does some meta-analyses. And she's like, why would that be? She does some behavior genetic stuff showing the environment has something to do with it. She spends like a decade studying life events, which seemed like a really good candidate for what in the environment might cause changes in personality. Doesn't bear as much fruit as she might have hoped. Now she's doing interventions. So you can like trace her entire career. And of course, she's done many things in addition, but like the through line of her career has been like this programmatic search for like why this personality change, particularly what about a person's life could change their personality. Whereas me, I have no idea what I do. I don't know like why I did it. There's a through line, I guess, or I could tell a story. Like if I have to give a job talk, I could pretend, but really it's all over the place relative to hers. And yours is a little bit maybe in between. This is all related to a question, believe it or
Mhm.
not, which is I've been asking everybody, and you already spoke to this a little bit, like if in reflecting on like what drives you, like post tenure, when the truth is we could just like teach our classes and not show up if we wanted to, and we get paid, right? And nobody does this, or very few people do this, because something drives them to do work, to do research, to mentor students, whatever, to do a good job, basically. And people give very different answers for this. Like, I think Vipka would give a very different answer than mine. You already said like a lot of it has to do with your clinical interests. You wanted to try to capture what you were observing in the consulting room, sort of marry object relations, the internal richness with interpersonal model, which had more structure and empirical structure, I guess. And the narcissism thing too, like you were afraid these patients were going to get missed. But if you had like responsibility pie, like you get up in the morning and you want to work, even though you don't have to. Like, what
Mhm.
is it? Is it the fame? Is it the money? Is it the is it the curiosity? Is it the responsibility? Is it the
I don't know. I think it's probably changed over the years in some
yeah?
ways. I think earlier in my career, of course, we're all set up in the if we're in academia, at least in the U.S. Uh, we have to get tenure. So you're saying now that you're post tenure, you're post promoted, what are you doing? But sure, I think early in my career, I both wanted to champion the interpersonal approach, but I also wanted to be successful as a scholar, and there are certain things one does in order to do that. But what really has struck me now is, looking back, is how fucking right Eric Erickson is about this concept of generativity. Because at this point, and not just like in 2026, but for quite a while now, I get up in the morning and I think the major reason I do what I do is generativity, right? I'm usually thinking about most of my work is collaborative, whether it's with students or it's with colleagues like you. You're more than a colleague to me. But it's what can I do to both play with people that I really care about and also help people that I really care about. And most of what I'm doing for the last, I'd say, 20 years or maybe 15 years is, uh, what could Chris and I do that would be exciting and fun? I just got, as an example, I work with an Italian psychologist, very young psychologist named Erica Fonti, who just got her PhD last year. And she came and visited my lab for a semester, and we did all kinds of really good stuff. And I really like working with her, and we're still working together. So I got an email from her this morning. Oh, we did a paper together for Current Psychology on it's a special issue on psychodynamic research, and we used EMA to look at and the interpersonal model to look at projection and transference in real world settings, related that to narcissism and paranoia. And it's like for her, this is like she's so excited, right? Like this is maybe her whatever sixth or seventh publication. This one came out of her dissertation, which I was also on her committee and things like that. And that's the most important part to
Totally.
me is how fun it is to get that kind of email in the morning. It says our paper got published, and this young professional starting out is really excited and happy about it and feels accomplished, and I got to help with that.
I'm gonna go see Erica in October. Actually, we'll toast you. Maybe we'll, depending on the timing, maybe we'll text you.
Yeah.
Um, uh, yeah, this is true. Like another whatever paper for me, does that mean I have to like fill out forms? Whereas if your student has a paper, then it really means something.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hey, I'll tell you, like just another thing that happened yesterday. This is the example, right? So I have my last graduate student. I have one graduate student in residence, one who's graduating in a couple months, but one that's still in residence. Her name is Parandis Portigan. She's from Iran. And she just ran CADE analyses, continuous assessment of interpersonal dynamics. We had this idea. We took the Symphora tapes, which are these tapes of like Otto and Lorna and Rockland and Linehan,
I
all
see.
working with the same patient, so to speak. And she oversaw training and CADE coded it, and she just started running her analyses. And we're finding that Cade can are sensitive to differences in orientation, which we can do because it's the same patient and the same story, but it's, seven different master clinicians. And I just opened up the data, here's the first set of results. And I just opened up that file yesterday morning and I was like, whoa, this looks great.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I told her, now here's this new paper from Chris Hopwood, your one on ways of organizing K data for
Yeah, yeah.
psychotherapy.
With Nancy
And I,
McWilliams and Judith Beck and
yeah,
Les Greenberg. Yeah.
so I said, read this, much like Les maybe suggested you read my chapter. I said, read this and decide if there's anything in there that we haven't planned to do that we should add to this now that you're feeling a little bit of mastery over the craziness of getting K data into, analytic form. So that's another thing that's just incredibly rewarding to me. Why I get up in the morning is because I get emails from Erica and I get emails from Parandis, and they're both really excited about what they're doing.
Well, I certainly have felt that throughout my career. You've been super generative, and I'm grateful for the many things that you've done. But also, I mean, there's sort of two parts. You're talking about the generative helping junior people out, but also like the social piece. I think for me, this is actually the main driver of like, I like doing fun stuff with my friends. And for whatever bizarre reasons, this is what I think is fun somehow. And I can't play basketball anymore, so it's like music and science. Those are my jams.
Yeah,
Okay, I gave you a homework assignment.
right.
And the homework assignment was, if I remember it right, you have a student who comes to you and says, I've been working with a student on a project that you're not supervising. I give them feedback. They get like defensive and kind of blamey and sensitive. And I want to be able to make my point. I want to keep my friendship with this person, but I'm feeling like they're not listening to me. And the harder I push, the worse it gets. What should I do? And I have, if you'd like, I can share a picture of, say, uh, maybe the interpersonal situation model would be a good thing for you, or would you like the
Sure.
single
Yeah,
surface circle? Or
that's
okay,
good.
sorry
I
for
like
just
that.
okay, let's do that then.
Yeah. Well, I thought about this, and to me, what I was hearing, the clinician in me, of course, won't say I need more information, but I'm going to work with the information you gave me. Uh, uh, and so I thought about this, and I said, well, there's a couple of different ways, places within this interpersonal situation where I think the student might be speaking to, and so we need to figure this out. So that's the first part. That's sort of how I might try to understand what's going on. And then maybe there's some things I could suggest to improve things. So the understanding of what's going on part is that I'm hearing the student say, I'm being like this. So that's the curved arrow, the perception of the self, right? But they're being like that, which is the perception of the other. And it seems to me that the first place to start is to figure out whether or not one of those two, or also, by the way, also the perception of the other onto the student who's complaining. So you got both directions there. The only thing we don't really know from this right now is how the other person sees themselves. So I think that there's three places where there's possibly some distortion going on that we need to unpack. Either the student tells me they're remaining calm, but they're not as aware of how they're coming across. So it might be instigating some defensiveness. It could be that they're misperceiving the other person as reacting that way when they're actually not. That would speak more to the student who's complaining to me's motives, what they want. Or it could be that the other person is distorting my student and seeing what is a calm and reasonable, communication as somehow a threat to themselves. So I don't really know where the problem lies yet. That's what I would want to try to flesh out. I might just ask my student, well, walk me through the last time this happened. What did you say? What did they say? And try to get a more of a living feeling of what the exchange is like. And then I would probably be thinking about motives. It's sort of like, it sounds like on the face of it, the other student involved, my student wants to work in a way where they have some agency, they have some impact, but they want to stay friendly with the other person. It seems like the other person's motive, if we just take everything at face value, is I want to stay in control of everything. And so if my motive
Interesting.
is I want to stay in control of everything, then anything the other person does that suggests I'm not fully in control is being responded to with a way of trying to reestablish a sense of control, right? It could also be that my student is overly sensitive and isn't aware that somebody disagreeing when you offer your opinion doesn't necessarily mean that they're being mean and hostile toward you. So we have to I would have to unpack this a little more. And it is about motives, it's about perceptions, it's about affect. And I would probably be asking questions around all of those things. What were you feeling? What do you think they were feeling? How were they behaving? Um, it was a pretty sparse description, right? To really that required a lot of assumptions. But this is just
Yeah.
an example of how I might work through and clarify what's going on. If we clarified what was going on, then the kinds of recommendations I might make to the student really are consistent with how we approach things interpersonally in relationship and even in therapy. We talk about two major sort of interventions. You can meta communicate. So although the student's been communicating about their thoughts and then getting kind of feeling like they're being reacted to in a defensive way, have they said anything like, when I do this, when I say these things, it feels I feel you respond this way and it makes me feel a certain way. So would meta communication about the situation help? Or to use complementarity in a strategic way, interpersonal complementarity in a strategic way. So it might be that I want to express an opinion that's different from yours, but I might need to do it in a less surgent way, as Lou Goldberg might say. I might have to do it in a more submissive way. So this is one of the things I really learned from Lorna watching her work was that she could really do anything at any position on the circle. Like she could assert herself but do it in a more submissive, a more soft way, or she could assert herself in a way that really kind of took control of everything. And so I would be talking to the student about how you might approach making room to offer your opinions when you're working with somebody who seems to need to feel in control all the time.
Like, I wonder if economical correlation would work here.
I'll work on that and let you know.
Yeah, yeah, right. So the meta communication piece is basically saying, like, look, I want to work together with you so that we can both have an effective role, but sometimes I feel like I'm not being heard. So you sort of make explicit what you're feeling on the inside and acknowledge, like, but maybe it's me. Maybe I'm
Right.
misunderstanding your reaction. Maybe you just disagree with me and it's your project, or maybe I'm actually being more aggressive than I realize.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
and if that doesn't work, and now you try, maybe another thing to try is, well, just simply asserting, I think we should do this, seems to trigger something in the other person. If we take that at face value, we take the student's perspective as basically valid. So maybe you have to be a little more strategic. Maybe you have to put some sugar on it in order to
Right.
get your point across.
When I do this in psychotherapy, what I say to patients or what I train students to do is, for instance, if they're offering an observation or an interpretation, is just to offer it from a one down position, right? To offer it from a position of, I may be wrong, or correct me if I'm wrong, or, but here's what I'm seeing. What do you think? And then I hand the autonomy right back to the patient to tell me what they think, including telling me that I'm crazy and I'm completely out of my mind about this.
Yeah. With which, of course, you don't have to agree. But the first step is like, is it me? And
Right.
like, you want to be pretty sure that that's not the problem before you start trying to figure out how to fix the other person.
Exactly.
Okay, let's see here. Everyone's been complaining that I don't give them enough information, but actually I think it works because you then have to do the process that you just did of like, well, this is what I would have to do to use the model to figure out what's really going on. So I think it doesn't bother me that you didn't have enough information, although I know that it made the task kind of ambiguous.
That's all right. It didn't bother me either. it meant I was going to have to go through that process, right? That I have no single answer for you. And as long as you're
Ever.
okay with that, it was fun.
Oh, hey man, speaking of fun, this has been fun. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this and everything that you've done for me throughout my career. And hopefully our paths cross again soon.
Well, thanks. It has been fun. And, similarly, not only is it fun to work with you and as we have for many years now, but I've learned a lot from you, and I really enjoyed thinking about how the future of interpersonal theory and research and interpersonal assessment is going to be changed and grow because you're part of it. And I'm really lucky that you are. So thanks a lot.
Thanks, Aaron. Take it easy.
See ya.